much every single time. Hello, I am Christian Stevenson with the Mississippi State University Extension Service here in Hancock County, Mississippi, joining you today by Zoom for the webinar or by YouTube if you are watching the recording of this presentation. And today we are going to talk about camellias in the home landscape. If you're listening by webinar, if you have any questions while I am talking, I'd invite you to put any questions you have in the chat area. I will see those come up. I'll be happy to answer them as we go or towards the end of the presentation. If you are watching on YouTube, by all means, please feel free to put a question down in the comments section, and I will be very happy to take a look at that and get a response to you. But camellias are a wonderful plant for the home landscape down here in the southeastern United States, Mississippi particularly. And I really enjoy them. I am surrounded on either side of Mississippi down here because Slidell, Louisiana, which is very close to me, is called Camellia City. So there's camellias all over the place. And camellias are the state flower of Alabama. So I don't have to go far to be sure that I'm going to see an awful lot of them. So a wonderful plant for the home landscape. I want to talk really quickly about where camellias come from and how they were introduced around the world. They have been grown, of course, they originate in Southeast Asia for the most part, and they have been cultivated for, as much as we know, for about 5,000 years. So there's a long history of growing camellias. Of course, the early records are for Camellia sinensis, which of course is the plant from which we get tea, and Camellia oleifera, which is where you get camellia oil. And I don't see a lot of camellia oil on the shelves here in the southeast United States, but it does have a lot of uses. So a really interesting plant there too. The genus Camellia was actually named by Carolus Linnaeus, of course, who is the person who designed our system of plant nomenclature that we use. And that was named to honor a fellow taxonomist, George Joseph Kamel. I apologize to anyone from his country, from Sweden, if I have horribly mispronounced that name. But he was an apothecary and a botanist, so he was honored with the name of the genus Camellia. The first camellias were introduced into Europe, into Portugal, in the 16th century. So the mid to late 1500s, and they were really widely cultivated in England in greenhouses. They were a plant that was essentially something for the very wealthy, because it was very expensive to grow and maintain camellias, but they were cultivated very broadly. Starting in about the mid 1700s, and those the first Camellia japonica was cultivated also in the 1700s. Of course, they were brought over to the United States as an ornamental plant, and of course we do have some tea production here as well. Without getting too deep into the taxonomy of Camellia, they are in the family Theaceae. Which really has, there are about 250 species in the genus Camellia. We are not going to talk that broadly about that many of those species. Most of those are in Southeast Asia, particularly in forests and in the mountainous areas. And certainly the camellias that we're going to be most familiar with are Camellia japonica and Camellia sasanqua, and some hybrids of those that are commonly used in the landscape. And generally speaking, to compare between the two of them, Camellia japonica tends to grow a bit larger, has bigger flowers, kind of a little bit more spectacular of a plant, while Sasanqua has smaller leaves, tends to have simpler flowers, but really makes up for that because it just puts on an absolute profusion of blooms. And as I mentioned, these are a very small selection of the species of Camellia that are out there. There are many others that are native to China, and you may also find some of the others in landscapes. Just to give you some images to work with, the Japanese Camellia, or Camellia japonica, tends to be about 6 to 12 foot tall, though they can get up to about 25 feet. The leaves have a really nice dark green color, kind of a leathery leaf that tends to be about 4 inches long. And they tend to bloom from midwinter into spring, and their flowers can be quite large, 3 to 5 inches in diameter. And you see whites and pinks and reds. And we'll get into flower shape in a second, but their flowers can be quite simple or quite complicated. So, that's a factor of the number and arrangement of petals that they have. Sasanqua camellias, or Camellia sasanqua, tends to be a little bit smaller of a plant, but still gets up to about 12 feet. There are some dwarf varieties out there that do stay quite small. They have smaller leaves, about 2 inches long. Still a nice, really good dark green color. Flowers tend to be white to pink, tend to be a little bit smaller, but really pleasant and fragrant. And they tend to bloom a little bit earlier than the japonicas do, so from mid-fall into early winter. Just to mention another couple of species, this is Camellia reticulata. It has really big flowers. It can be, again, about 12 foot tall to 8 foot wide, but they can grow quite large, up to about 50 feet. So, certainly a lot of variety in the size that they have, but unfortunately, they tend to be pretty susceptible to cold, which can be a problem in using them in the landscape. Camellia oleifera. Oleifera is a reference to the fact that you get the camellia oil principally for this, and so if you're looking for tea oil, Camellia oleifera is the plant that would be involved in that. Tend to have smaller flowers, simpler flowers, heights of about 15 to 20 feet, those same nice dark green leaves, but not one that you're going to tend to see in the landscape very often because it's principally just cultivated for tea oil. And you may notice that I didn't mention Camellia sinensis, the tea plant, in this. I am going to, at the end of the presentation, make just a couple of brief comments about that, but you're going to have to wait to the end to talk just a little bit about tea. So when we're talking about different kinds of camellias, in addition to the species, we can talk about the kind of flowers that particular camellia produces. And of course, there is an American Camellia Society, and they have names for the different types of flowers. We start off with single flowers. They have 5 to 8 petals in one row. The petals tend to be loose. They can be regular or irregular in shape. And you can see a picture of that kind of simple single flower arrangement up there at the top. Then we have semi-double, which is 2 or more rows, regular or irregular, loose outer petals. And right in the center, you can see that cluster of stamens in the center of the flower. And then you have the formal double. That's my favorite kind that I think is really pretty. A lot of different rows of petals, a large number of them. You don't see the stamen in the center because there's this kind of central cone of tightly furled petals that cover that up. Just to add in some more, you have anemone shaped flowers. So one or more rows, large outer petals that lay flat and might be undulating. And then you have some sort of petaloids in the center. You can see a picture of that up at the top. There is the peony shaped flower, deeply rounded. And then you have the loose peony and the full peony, just kind of whether, just how rounded its shape is, and how sort of convoluted the flower shape is. And then you have another, what I think is a really gorgeous one, the rose form doubles, have those overlapping petals. You may see stamens in the center when the flower is completely open, but I really like that sort of concentric formal shape in those flowers. But the real lesson that comes across from that is there's a lot of variety out there in terms of flower shape, in terms of flower size, and even in terms of flower color. So you can pick varieties of camellia that are going to have the flower shape that you enjoy. You don't have to have the same ones I do. I haven't gotten into the vast number of camellia varieties that there are out there. I got myself in trouble with the rose presentation when I mentioned, or the daylily presentation, where I mentioned a number of varieties, and I think I was a year off or 2 years off in looking at the number of varieties, because new varieties of these plants are coming out very regularly. So I'm going to hedge my bets by just saying that there are quite a lot of varieties out there. So it's well worth investigating the different varieties and finding ones that suit your landscape and have the appearance that you're going to enjoy. When you're selecting a camellia, generally speaking, there's a lot of things that are going to be the same sorts of things that you would want to look at whenever you're selecting any plant at a nursery. You want to make sure that that plant is healthy. I have when we had our conversation with Ms. Polly Cuevas, the nursery manager, one of the things that we talked about is looking at the root system. Most of your camellias that we're going to purchase here in the Southeast are going to be in containers. So really look at that root system, make sure it's not root bound, make sure that the root system looks really good and healthy, as that is a large part of what's going to determine whether you're going to have a good, healthy plant. After that, we want to look at all of the branches of the camellia. We want to make sure there's no dark spots, sunken areas. You can see a picture down at the bottom of this slide, a little section of camellia stem where it has what we call a canker, where a disease has affected that stem. We want to make sure we're not introducing that into the landscape. We want to make sure it doesn't have any bugs on it, so we don't want to take in a plant that has scale, because that can spread into our environment and affect our other plants. So just looking for a really good, healthy plant. Ideally, we want a plant that's uniformly shaped. So it's going to be a lot easier to keep that plant pruned and keep it in the shape we want it if it's already in kind of a uniform shape. So if it's leggy off to one side, or has one long branch that's extending far outward and the rest of them are kind of short, that's not going to be the best thing we want to look. We want nice, well-branched camellias with that uniform shape that don't have any insects, don't have any disease signs on them. Nice, really good dark green leaves are a good indication as well, to make sure that the fertilization is good, the root system is good with the plant that you're purchasing. And if you do that, you're going to have a good time. You're not going to have any problems with selecting a camellia that's going to grow well in your home landscape. Probably the most important thing in my mind in terms of growing camellias is growing them in a place that they're suited to. Where, I talk about a lot of different plants, and very often you hear the refrain, full sun, full sun, full sun, because we plant a lot of things that really do like to be out in the open. And camellias kind of are an exception to this. They really grow in areas where they're getting partial sun or partial shade, however you want to define that, but about 4 to 6 hours of sun, ideally in the morning, if we can do that, where they're getting that sunlight in the morning. And then as we get into the afternoon, when it's really hot, at least down here in the south, then we can have them in a lot more shade, and they're just going to thrive better in that location. You know, our other option is an area where they're kind of getting dappled sunlight throughout the day. So if they're kind of an understory plant beneath some other plants, that can work particularly well for them, because those taller plants can serve to intercept some of that light and keep them from being out in the full sun. When we do have camellias out in the full sun, we can notice some problems that can come up with them. They tend to be less dormant during winter warm periods. So if the temperature is warm, like we often get throughout the winter, we get a few cold days and then it warms up. Occasionally, that can cause the camellias to start to try to come out of dormancy and start to grow a little bit, start those buds coming out. And because of that any sudden temperature drop following that can lead to damage to the flower buds, can lead to leaf injury, and more severe problems with cold damage for the camellias. We also might see a little bit of yellowed leaves. That's just a kind of a good sign that the plant's under a little bit of water stress usually. And the flower buds, which is one of the things we really want the camellias for, may not open if they're planted right out in the full sun. The other really important thing we want to manage when we're planting a camellia is making sure we have it in an area with a well-drained soil. One thing that camellias are very much like the rest of our plants we have in our landscape is they just don't like having wet feet. So we want to make sure that they're in really nice, properly drained soil. Oftentimes when we have kind of a gradual decline in the quality or the vigor of a camellia plant, it's because the root system is having issues due to the soil it's in or the planting site just holding too much water for it. The other kind of thing that makes camellias really distinctive is like azaleas, they prefer a more acidic soil. So we've talked a little bit about azaleas. They like that more acidic soil. Camellias do as well. So in that pH range from about 5 up to about 6.5, which is just a little bit more acidic than we normally see for our landscape plants. Again, they don't, camellias are not going to tolerate a poorly drained soil. So if you have an area where you really want to plant one, but the soil is really holding water, you may want to consider putting them up on mounds or build a raised bed and put your camellia in that, because that raising that soil up either as a mound or as a raised bed is going to lift up that root zone into an area that's just going to have better drainage and better health for the plant. Again, pH 5 to 6.5, pH is really important for the ability of the plant to take up nutrients. And if you have the plant in an area where that pH is too alkaline or too high, you may start to see some problems with nutrient deficiencies, because the plant's just not able to take up those nutrients from the soil, even if you're applying them. Even if you're providing the nutrient, the plant's not able to take it up. Of course, if I'm going to give recommendations about fertilization, I always advocate doing a soil test, collecting soil from your landscape, bring it into the extension office. We're happy to send that off. For a very small fee. I call it the best $8 you can spend in horticulture. Just a great way to know exactly how to fertilize, because that's going to tell us what's already there in your soil. Generally speaking, you are going to want to fertilize camellias 3 times a year. One time is going to be in early March. then as we get into early May and as we get into early June. And you'll see directions on the time of fertilization on your soil test recommendations as well. But those times of year really just kind of reflect what's going on in plant growth to make sure that the plant has the nutrients that it needs as it's going through its life cycle for the year. I mentioned, planting camellias is very much like planting a lot of the other plants that we have in our home landscapes. Generally, particularly for containers, we're wanting to put those in the ground as we get into late fall or early winter. Today is the 6th of November. So now is an excellent time to go look for those plants and go ahead and prepare that planting site. Go out to the nursery and get yourself a new camellia or 10 because now is the time of year when we would want to plant that. Putting plants in this time of year is just going to reduce the amount of attention we have to pay because they're not going to be under the severe water stress that they would be if you put them in there when the temperatures were warming up. And because we have mild winters down here in the southeast, it's going to allow that root system to develop throughout the winter months. So as we get into the spring, that plant's going to be able to get growing really quickly. It's going to flower faster. Planting at this time of year is a really good guideline. That being said, you can put a container plant in the ground essentially any time of year. You just have to really pay attention to make sure that you're watering that plant regularly and thoroughly, just to reduce any potential stress it's under as it's adapting to that new environment. Just like really any container, I often use the phrase, you want to put a 50-cent plant in a $5 hole. Make sure that hole you dig for your camellia is about 2 times wider than the container that it's in, and no deeper than the root ball. You want to make sure that the height of the plant, you can see the soil line from the container. You want that soil line to be maintained as it gets into that new environment. But you want a lot of really good loose soil around it so that roots are going to have an easy time expanding out into it. It is a good idea to mulch camellias immediately when you put them in the ground. It's just going to help maintain the soil moisture that's in there, help them deal with any potential transplant stress by keeping those that temperature modulated, as well as keeping that water available there for the plant. The other thing it will do is it will reduce weeds around the new plant. Weeds are competition. They're taking up the nutrients that the plant needs. We don't want that to happen. So by mulching around the plant, we block out that sunlight, prevent those weeds from being there, and let that camellia have all the nutrients that are there in that soil. Watering camellias, you want to apply water slowly so they can get as much penetration as possible. Wet that soil down to a depth of about 15 to 18 inches, so they really can take that water. And then, as it dries out, you want to water again. Make sure you're giving it plenty of water, particularly during that first summer after you transplant it. But you don't want to drown it. Generally speaking, throughout the first year, just watering once a week is perfectly sufficient. That means watering deeply but infrequently. I know you've heard that before if you have been participating in these presentations. Watering deeply but infrequently really promotes that root system stretching out to go and get the water that it needs. And so when there's a little bit of a water deficit, there's more root system there to support that plant. Pruning is an infrequent thing for camellias. It's not something that you really have to do on a regular basis, unless you might be shaping them into a hedge, in which case that sort of shaping pruning is something you kind of need to keep up with. But for most camellias, you don't really have to do anything, but maybe knock their size back if they're getting a little bigger than you want them to be. But if their growth isn't nice and bushy, if they're starting to stretch out a little bit, you can prune them in May or early June, and they'll take that fairly well. Particularly if you have a plant that's starting to be kind of spreading, it looks really thinned out. Pinching off the tips of vigorous shoots will stimulate branching. The little tip of that branch sends down a little signal to the rest of that branch and says, I'm growing here, you stay still. But when you remove the tip of that branch, it stops that signal. And so branches can form, side shoots can form off of that branch, really giving the camellia a much nicer bushy appearance. And so, that works really well just to keep that nice compact shape for the plant. And you're doing that right when the plant's really starting to put on some vegetative growth for the year. If you have a plant that's just completely overgrown, it's getting bigger than it needs to be, then we want to do that pruning in late winter. For down here on the coast, I tended to find that as February, though depending on where you are, it's kind of weather-based rather than calendar-based. But you can cut camellias down to 12 to 18 inches above the ground. They can take that kind of regeneration pruning, remove most of the limbs, pretty much all of the foliage, and then they will shoot back out from that. You'll start to see sprouts emerging 6 to 8 weeks later after that kind of late winter pruning. And then, you may have a 2 to 3 foot plant on your hands by the end of the summer. So, that's one of those really good plants where, they call this regeneration pruning or rejuvenation pruning. Rejuvenation literally means to make young again. So a plant that's just starting to get a little tired, you can do this. And it just really, it's almost like getting a whole new plant. The other thing that you might want to prune for, we'll talk about scale insects a little bit as we get towards the end of the presentation. And pruning is used as a management technique. If you have a really bad infestation, pruning away some of the branches that are affected can just make it a lot easier to deal with that problem. We'll address that a little bit more specifically when we talk about T-scale. I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about propagating camellias. I was fortunate to go over to, George County, Mississippi fairly recently and got to see a whole bunch of people propagating camellias. And I know this is a big thing. There's camellia societies out there. There are camellia societies out there that do an awful lot of this and have a really good time with it. I am just very briefly going to talk about 4 different methods of propagating camellias that you can use, and that's going to start off with just planting seeds. Some types of camellia are prolific seed producers. You have those big seed pods that are produced after the flower fades. The seeds are about the size of an acorn. And they mature in the fall, and you can go ahead and plant them right then. There's no necessity for waiting. And that has the advantage, it is really easy to propagate by seed. You just take the seed, put it in the ground. We'll talk about that in a second. It's not quite that easy. Make sure that it stays with moisture, and you can get a large number of camellia plants relatively inexpensively. It's also, your camellia plants are crossing. So if you're just interested in seeing what kind of new camellia you can get, then planting by seed is a way to do that. Of course, that does give you the disadvantage that new camellia may look nothing like its parent, and it does take several years for that seedling to bloom. But you can see some pictures of some germinating seeds there, as well as a picture of the seeds on the plant. Camellia seeds do have a really hard seed coat, and so it is important to soak the seed for about 12 hours to aid in germination. Just needs to take in a lot of water and break that dormancy that's imposed by having that really hard seed coat. Occasionally, you'll see recommendations to crack the seed. I have not had good luck with that. I tend to overcrack them a little bit, and then they're no good anymore. But after you've soaked them in water, you can put them in peat moss or a combination of peat moss and sand, and just make sure that that soil stays good and moist. And they tend to germinate after about a month. So you have to exercise a little bit of patience to see those new camellia seed coming up. And you may, in fact, if you've waited a little bit after the seed are harvested, those seeds may take quite a while to come up. It may be the next spring before you see those new little seedlings coming up above the ground. Once you've got that seedling coming up and it's got its first true leaves and you're ready to put it into a container, when you take that seedling out, it's going to have a really long taproot. So what you want to do, you can see a picture there in the sort of the top middle. You want to cut that taproot kind of just like you would cut the end of a branch to promote internal branching. What you're doing there is promoting it to put off more lateral roots, really fibrous roots that are really going to serve it well in a container as that plant develops. It's going to have a lot of root area to take up water and nutrients. Another way that we can propagate camellias is by air layering. This is going to produce essentially a clone of the plant we already have. And we want to do this in the spring on shoots that were produced on the previous season or mid to late summer on shoots from the current season's growth. And just choose an area that's right below a node, so right below where a leaf is coming out or where there's a bud, about a foot from the end of a branch, and just remove the leaves and twigs on that stem 4 inches above and below that point. So you're going to produce a long, kind of straightish area with no leaves coming off of it. That in total is going to be about 6 to 8 inches long. And you can kind of see that there on that top image just a little bit. So ideally, we want about a pencil diameter stem for creating that layer. And we are going to take a really good, sharp, clean blade and remove an inch ring of bark from the stem, leaving that woody tissue in the center exposed. So we've made sure we've removed all of that cambium tissue, all of the tissue that grows new plant tissue away, because that will, if we allow it to, they'll actually join back, but we want that to be able to start generating roots for us rather than just being stem tissue. Ideally, we will apply a rooting hormone like root tone to this area, and that's going to kind of promote the formation of new roots. Take a nice ball of moist sphagnum moss, wrap that around the area, and then you can wrap it with plastic, fasten the ends with electrician's tape or twist ties, whatever works best for you. What that's going to do is it's going to hold moisture down, right where right where you're creating that layer, and that's going to, allow that plant to form those roots. If it's out in the sun, cover it with a plastic layer, kind of keep it out of the exposure of the sun. And if the layer takes, it's going to start forming roots in about 3 to 7 weeks. So, just shy of 2 months, you can go out there and kind of take a look at it and peek at it and see how it's doing. When it's got a really nice, well-developed root system, you can just cut it right below the layer and transfer it to a container. Put it in the shade, make sure that it has really good water access, and let it develop in that container, and it's going to be a new healthy camellia plant for you. We also propagate camellias by grafting. We're essentially grafting camellias to camellias to propagate the kind of camellia that we want. Grafted camellias can produce blooms very quickly, so about 2 years. And essentially, we're just connecting a really nice, vigorous rootstock with a variety of that we like, that has the flower and leaf qualities and growth qualities that we want. And because it has that understock that has a really good, well-developed root system, those scions or those new plants that have been grafted can grow quite quickly and very vigorously, so they're going to grow faster than a seedling would. Ideally, this is something, again, that we want to do in about February, and that would generally be about 4 weeks or a month or so before we would start to see the foliage growing, and allows the scion time to join up, to form callus tissue, to get a union between the xylem and phloem cells in the understock and in the scion wood, in order to start stimulating that new growth. And generally, you're going to use Japonica or Sasanqua varieties as your understock for this. So a little bit better picture to kind of show what you're doing. Cleft grafting is just kind of what it sounds like. You have a understock that you've cut about 1.5 to 2 inches above the ground, just flat with the ground, and then you take a good sharp, preferably kind of thin blade, and you split that stalk right down the center, forming a cleft. Then you want to take your scion wood, and you're going to cut that into a wedge shape, and you insert that wedge shape into that cleft. Oftentimes you'll use something like a screwdriver to kind of to separate that cleft a little bit very gently in order to insert that scion wood without damaging it. And the idea is you want to mate up. You can see on the bottom picture, you can see that green right underneath the bark of the understock, and then the green of the scion that's there. You want to mate up that cambium tissue, the xylem and phloem cells and the cambium tissue there, because that's what's going to grow together to make that new grafted plant. Ideally, you want your understock to be about 1/2 inch to about 1.5 inches. Anything long, anything smaller is going to have a hard time accepting that scion. Anything bigger than that, as it's pushing back together onto that scion, it's going to exert a lot of pressure. So if you do have a plant that you want to use as understock that's bigger than 1.5 inches, rather than making that cleft off, right down the center, you are going to generally put it off, kind of offset to the side, just to release the amount of pressure that's going to be on that understock. But I just generally try to stick to about 1.5 inches and smaller, because I think that tends to work really better. As ever, whenever you're talking about grafting, you want to make sure that you use a really good, clean, sharp blade. Keep any soil or any other contaminants out of the cut area, because that can interfere with the formation of that union between the graft and cause the graft to fail. Here, I think the directions that I really just gave, you want to take the scion from a dormant terminal of the variety that you like. That's just the end of a branch that's not actively growing right now. You want that scion to be about 2 to 3 inches long. with 1 to 3 vegetative buds. So it should have about, ideally 2 or 3 buds on that scion wood. Remove all but 2 or 3 terminal leaves. And again, you force open that graft with a screwdriver in the center, place the scion. You can place 2 on a single graft, 1 on either side, and that tends to work really well. And if the rootstock is quite small and the understock is quite small, you can wrap a rubber band around it just to put a little bit more pressure on it to make sure that it keeps that scion in place. You're also going to want to wrap some grafting tape around it, just to kind of hold everything in place. And oftentimes people will use grafting wax around that. It's not, grafting wax in my experience doesn't do a great job of holding the graft in place, but it does do a really good job of sealing moisture in, because moisture loss can cause all sorts of problems, and again, cause that graft to fail. One of the things that's really important, if you're dealing with a plant that's in a pot, being able to maintain humidity around the graft is really important. So if you can put a little, plastic around it to create a greenhouse effect, that's going to hold the humidity in, and again, can increase the success of your grafting. We can also, a little bit more simply, propagate camellias from cuttings. Allows, again, a really quick propagation of new plants. You want to take cuttings when new growth is about 80% hardened off, which is generally going to be kind of right in the middle of summer for us, July and August. And a cutting is going to be about 3 to 4 inches long with 2 to 3 buds on it. Just cut it at an angle. Score right. Make a really good clean cut. The cleaner the cut, the better. The sharper the blade you can use, the better you're going to do with this. And cutting it at an angle is to increase the surface area of that cambium tissue that's exposed. You can then turn it around and just right down the length, you can score the opposite side for about 1 inch, again, just exposing a little bit more cambium tissue. Then you want to just dip it into a rooting hormone, stick it into a moist medium, good moist soil medium down to 1 inch depth. And again, keep those in a good humid environment. Your enemy here is water loss, water stress. So keeping the temperature, around 70 degrees, a really good humid environment. And you may see, or you hope to see root development somewhere between 6 to 8 weeks. And then, leave them in that container, let that root system really develop thoroughly. And they should be ready to go out to the landscape in about 8 months. All right, so talk about insect and disease pests of camellias. The first one that we want to talk about is root rot. And I mentioned earlier that camellias do not well tolerate poorly drained soil. Root rots are kind of a sure sign that the issue is an area where you have too much water in the soil. And there are fungi, or more properly, kinds of water molds that get into the really fine roots of the camellia. And what it starts to cause decline of the plant. So you start to see the plant turning yellow or wilting. You might see the top leaves of the plant start to die back or drop leaves. And really the most important management for root rots is proper site selection, making sure that you have really good drainage for the plants, making sure that you're checking those root systems before you bring the plant to your home environment. And that's going to solve most of your problems with root rots. Unfortunately, they can be very difficult to treat because of where the root, where the fungus is. You can't just spray the foliage, generally speaking. And once we start to see symptoms of these root rots, the problem can be fairly advanced before we're able to apply a treatment. Camellia flower blight, another problem caused by a fungus. and it tends to show up when we have kind of cool, moist conditions in the early spring, just before we're getting that early bloom. And you start to see kind of, spots, like single, brown or tan areas right at the center of the flower. And then they, will expand outward to encompass, intentionally, essentially the entire bloom. You'll often see this on shaded flowers, because the shaded flowers are, less exposed to the sun, so water is not evaporating from them very quickly. Um, and many disease and fungal pests require an extended period of time with free water on the surface of the plant in order for it to affect the plant at all. Really good diagnostic for this is that the affected tissue kind of feels slimy. In terms of management, pruning away or picking up any infected flowers and getting rid of them is going to interrupt the life cycle of the plant. Replacing mulch, so any of this fungus that has gotten down into that mulch cannot splash back up onto the plant, is really important for management. But you can spray with some fungicides as a method to manage this as well. We'll occasionally see twig dieback on camellias. Looks a lot like symptoms of root rot, but if we catch it early and it's only affecting one twig, we're only going to see it on that one twig, caused by yet another fungus, Glomerella cingulata. And generally, it's going to start off as a small kind of dark sunken area on a twig or on a stem. And then as that canker or that sore enlarges, it encircles the limb, does what we call girdling, and it essentially cuts off the transport of water up to the top of that stem, which can cause that stem to die back. One of the things we want to do to manage this is essentially prune away the parts of the plant that are infected, because we keep in mind that a lot of the things we're doing for plant health, they're not going to be curative. They're just keeping it from spreading. So pruning those branches away, because they're never they're not going to come back, is going to prevent the spread of this problem. Make sure when we're doing this that we disinfect our pruning shears, because if we go to another plant later, we don't want to transfer the fungus from one plant to another. You are going to want to spray with a fungicide as well, just to provide a little bit more protection and prevent the fungus from affecting any other parts of that plant. A little bit less serious, we have algal leaf spot. This is a common problem we see on camellias. We also see this on magnolias, and it is caused by an algae or algae. And you see those sort of gray-green or tan spots on the leaves. They can be quite large, and occasionally they can be really prolific, particularly if there's a lot of water. And direct sunlight is something that's also going to favor the development of this disease. Pruning it to increase airflow can help, and applications of copper fungicides can also be beneficial to get rid of algal leaf spot. We do see leaf gall caused by yet another fungus, Exobasidium camelliae. And you get those thickened and enlarged leaves. We see similar problems like this on azalea. And what we want to do is just remove those thickened leaves. You can pick them off or cut them off, ideally before they turn white, like you see in that bottom picture, because that's when they're producing all the spores that can help spread this problem. And we tend to see this more on Sasanqua than we would on Camellia japonica. So again, this is just another problem where the best solution is just to remove the affected tissue. Fortunately, this is a problem, while it can be a little bit unsightly, it doesn't tend to be too terribly serious. We're going to start talking about insects in a second. So now we talk about the thing that kind of represents we'll call it a disease, but it's caused by bugs. Sooty mold is a response to aphids and whiteflies and scale insects exuding a sugary substance as they feed. We call that honeydew. And then this fungus that causes sooty mold uses that honeydew as a food source. Sooty mold, is really a sign that we need to deal with that insect pest. And after that pest is dealt with, this black stuff will just wear off of the plant. We can wash the plant if it's small enough, but it doesn't tend to be fatal, but it does kind of reduce the vigor of the plant because it's interrupting sunlight being able to reach the leaves. So it is something that we want to deal with. Probably the most serious insect issue that we have on camellias are scale insects. And we do see several different scale insects that affect camellias. You see T-scale and wax scale and oleander scale. Largely speaking, they're all going to be treated very much the same way. You tend to find the actual scale insects on the stems or on the underside of leaves. Oftentimes you'll see that kind of whitish material that are the cast-off skins of or cast-off exoskeletons, more properly, of the scales, kind of stuck there. And what we very frequently first see to tell us that we have a scale problem is yellowing of the leaves and kind of that speckled appearance. We turn over the leaf and then we see all that white material and we know we have a scale problem. If you just have a scale problem on one little section of the plant, and if it's an area that can be pruned away, that is a great way to solve that problem. Scale insects themselves can be quite resistant to insecticides, but the immatures are susceptible to using insecticidal soap or horticulture oil. You will have to spray several times to get effective control because you're kind of trying to kill off the immatures. If the plant is actively growing, you can check those new growing areas of the plant to see if they're developing scale, because the scale insects tend to kind of be stuck to the plant. So even after they've passed away, they still stick there for a little bit until they wear off. So checking new growth is an easy way to see if you've got the problem under control. We do get mites, spider mites and bud mites. The infested plants tend to have kind of a dusty appearance, and we may see webbing appear on the plants as well if there's a heavy infestation. Often does lead to distorted or poor quality flowers. It's really hard to see the individual mites just because of their size. But again, horticultural oils can be used as a method to deal with this. Aphids are a common problem on camellias, just like they are a common problem on just about everything else. Usually find them on the stems of new growth and on the underside of leaves. Populations can build up really quickly. Again, they can be treated with horticultural oils. One of the most severe issues they cause, particularly when they're on new growth, is they can cause distortion of that new growth and make the new growth just not very attractive. So those are the insects that I wanted to talk about. Now I'm going to talk very quickly about kind of an interesting practice, not necessarily something I recommend for everyone, but I think it's interesting, so I wanted to mention it, and that is called gibbing. Gibbing is the practice of applying a plant growth regulator or plant hormone called gibberellin, usually in the form of gibberellic acid. That is a growth regulator that is produced by most plants, and applying it to the plant results in increased flower size and increased flower quality. And not only that, but the flowers will stay on the plant for longer than normal. So normally when we are going to do this, this process is done in September and October, where you have a leaf bud that is immediately adjacent to a flower bud. You can see a picture of that over to the side there. It just gives you kind of an idea of what you're looking at. I unashamedly stole those pictures from one of the Camellia societies, but you can see that really nice pointy leaf bud next to that large kind of rounded flower bud, and you want to pinch away or twist away that leaf bud. And that just leaves a little bit of a cup there. And right in that little cup that's left over by that leaf bud, you put a single drop of your gibberellic acid, and that will translocate to the flower and affect the growth of the flower. Generally, you'll start to see a difference in about 2 weeks, though that'll vary a little bit according to variety, and varieties vary broadly in how they respond to this. Generally, if it's going to flower early, they'll bloom within about 30 days. If they bloom late, it may take 2 months to 3 months to open up. And it's important, you don't want to do this to every flower. That can cause a lot of stress on the plant. So if you have a large camellia, you treat 5 to 10 buds a week, and that just gives you flowers over a really long period of time. Now the trick is that you cannot just go down to the local garden center and buy this plant growth hormone. The American Camellia Society does sell it, so you can contact them or one of your local Camellia Society, and they may have access to it. Or I'm sure, these being the days of the internet, you can purchase just about everything online these days. All right, so I just wanted to close out talking very quickly about tea. Tea, of course, is from Camellia sinensis. There are many different kinds of tea. We're going to keep this fairly narrow for the purposes of a conversation into 2 broad kinds: Chinese tea or China tea, which is generally grown in China or Japan, and then Assam tea, which is grown principally India, which tends to have some differences in its leaves, has a larger leaf, and a little bit different flavor to the tea. Optimum temperature for tea growth is from 65 to 86 degrees Fahrenheit. They prefer full sun to partial shade. And you can purchase tea plants to grow at home. Generally, about 1 tea bush is going to produce about half a pound of tea. So I don't drink a lot of tea, but certainly something that might be an entertaining thing to do in the home garden is to have your own camellia or your own tea plant and prepare that. So in terms of harvesting tea, when we harvest tea, we're harvesting the very 2 to 3 top leaves and the terminal bud in order to make that tea. So just the very tip of the branches. And there are 3 broad kinds of tea that vary by their length of what we're going to call fermentation, even though it's not really fermentation. So after we have harvested the tea, that tea starts undergoing kind of a oxidation. It starts breaking down and drying out. And so how long we allow that process to go is really what they're calling fermentation, even though it's not really fermenting in any way that we would actually call that. But to stop that process of oxidation, they either steam the leaves or pan fry them before they're completely dried out, and that stops that process at different stages. So there's green tea, which I do quite enjoy. Only China type teas are used for this. They are not fermented at all, so they're processed immediately. Those leaves are steamed or pan heated at that temperature, quite high temperature for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then dried out for another 10 to 15 minutes. And that is the process for green tea. Oolong tea is fermented for a short period of time. The leaves and the stem wilt in the sun for half an hour to an hour, and then dry in the shade for about 8 to 10 hours. prior to them heating in a pan. Again, those are your temperatures, and I have clearly written those temperatures incorrectly there. I wrote a 1 instead of a 4 for 15 minutes, and then they're rolled and allowed to dry. And then finally, we get to the kind of tea that I particularly like, which is black tea. That's what most of us here in the South are going to be familiar with. And that is fermented until it is black. Those leaves are dried down to when they're 55 to 70% moisture. Then they're cut and rolled, allowed to ferment, and then finally dried. So what's different isn't the plant. What's different is how the leaves are managed. And there are tea plantations, of course, here in the United States. We're very familiar with those from drinking iced tea down here in the South. But we are also fortunate. We do have some tea companies here in Mississippi. I'm located in Hancock County, but there are some tea producers in Pearl River County, as well as around Brookhaven, Mississippi, that are quite good and have a wonderful product that I really recommend people to get out there and get. I know one of them makes a blueberry tea that I particularly enjoy. So I would encourage you to try out those Mississippi tea companies because they really do produce a good product. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and stop my share. I appreciate it. If you've made it to the end of the presentation, thank you very much. If you are on YouTube, again, you can put your questions down in the bottom in the comments section, and I will be very happy to answer those for you. If you're interested in knowing when other presentations come out, hit the subscribe button, and you'll get notified whenever I put on a new video. Otherwise, I'm going to take some time now. If you're here with me live, I'm going to take some time to answer any